He's a prolific author. He's written Mindsight, the Pocket Guide to Interpersonal Neurobiology, The Developing Mind, now in its second edition, The Mindful Therapist, The Mindful Brain, Parenting from the Inside Out, and The Whole Brain Child. You can learn more about Dan and his offerings at the mindsightinstitute.com, or I should say, to be clear here, its URL is www.mindsightinstitute.com. So anyway, welcome, Dan. It's a great pleasure to have you here in this program.
Thanks, Rick. It's a pleasure to be here. And in the professional side, what I wanted to do was try to understand the nature of the mind and the nature of health. And what emerged from that long journey through science is something I think wisdom traditions have known for a long time, which is the idea that being kind and being compassionate is what emerges from well-being. And I was really fascinated to see that even if you leave the wisdom traditions aside and just look at your own inner life from a personal perspective and also a scientific view of what health is, a healthy mind, then you see that kindness and compassion are a natural part of health. So for me, compassion and the brain are important because they show well-being inside of ourselves and well-being in our relational worlds. And I hope we'll get into that, Rick, as I know, you and I have talked about on our own, this idea of how you bring positive efforts to have a healthier world is just so important on so many levels. So it's personal for me in this deep sense that it is ultimately, as I was saying to my kids just this weekend, a good day for me is when you can do something a little bit to not only, savor the world, but to try in your small way, however you can, to save the world and move it toward health, which is a quote from some poet that I can't remember exactly. But it's a beautiful idea of savoring and saving the world.
That's great. Thank you very much. You've been a pioneer in linking awareness of oneself and a deep awareness of others. You could think of that perhaps as a kind of inwardly directed empathy as well as an outwardly directed empathy. And you've developed these notions of the connection, the linkages between these two, and coined the term Mindsight. I wonder if you could say more about why you think it's important to connect these two and what you mean by the word Mindsight and how all this works in the brain.
Sure. That's a great question, Rick. Thank you. The word Mindsight was a word I invented around 1979, 1980, because when I was in my professional training, which was to start in medicine, a number of my professors seemed to lack this skill to actually see the inner subjective life of their patients or even of their students. Even though they were really bright, they knew a lot of facts, they somehow were ignoring the inner experience of someone they were taking care of. So, for example, if they came up with laboratory tests that showed a person had a fatal illness, they would just give them that information and then move to the next room without caring for the person's inner emotional response or even their outward expressions with tears, their look of fear, their look of devastation. And I couldn't understand how in the world that could happen, that a smart, devoted professor could miss seeing the inner life of someone. So I ultimately dropped out of school and didn't want to have that be my future, to become like that. So when I decided to go back to school, I had this word in my head, Mindsight, that is the ability to see the inner see, to see the see inside, basically, to see your feelings and your thoughts and your intentions, the dreams you have, the meaning of something, the narrative you have, all that stuff. So I had to make up this word and keep it very private inside of my personal life, and it relates to your first question. And so having, that in my mind when I went back to school helped me so that when I saw a professor who didn't have this skill or didn't show this skill, I would say to myself, this person, is missing mindsight, and do not use this as a role model for who you're going to try to be like. And I'd have other professors who did have mindsight, and I became fascinated with, what does it mean to see your own inner life? What does it mean to see the inner life of someone else? And after I started in pediatrics and moved on to psychiatry and ultimately did child psychiatry and then became a researcher in attachment, I was very interested in how attachment relationships, the relationships between parents and children, have mindsight or not. And it was at a time when new words were coming into the scientific field. Theory of mind had been created around the same time, and then mentalization and reflective function, mind-mindedness, all these wonderful scientific concepts, which mindsight would include then the idea that you could actually study in a research protocol when a parent sees the inner life of the child, or even the inner life of the parent herself or himself. Those are families where the children thrive. And so back in 1989, when I first started studying this, I wanted to ask the question, how does that work in the brain? How does seeing the mind make a difference for a child's development? How does a child's brain develop in a setting where the parent sees his mind, or how does it develop differently if a parent doesn't see his mind? And so the beginning of the 90s was really an effort to work as both a researcher and I became an educator at that time, and also a therapist, to work with this idea of mindsight and how it was, in many ways, the central mechanism of secure attachment and emotional intelligence and even social intelligence. And it wouldn't be till years later, many years later, that I learned about this whole field called mindfulness, which is different but has some overlaps with mindsight. So that's where the term comes from, and it's been really exciting to see how it overlaps with all these other endeavors people have had to understand the mind and bring health into the world.
So if it's okay, I'll take it a step further, Dana. How is mindsight distinct from empathy? I mean, empathy is a pretty well-known construct. Also, how is mindsight distinct from self-awareness? Or in particular, and for me that was what was very exciting, actually, I think for a lot of other people in your work here, was pointing out the overlap, if you will, between the function of empathy for others and empathy for oneself, awareness of others, awareness of self, mindfulness of others, mindfulness of self. I mean, it's their intersection, their overlap in the brain, which creates lots of opportunities for strengthening, those neural substrates in various ways. And I wondered if you could speak more to that, because to me that's really at the nubbin of what's especially useful in your perspective here.
Sure. Well, absolutely. When you read about the science of empathy, you discover soon that term has about 8 different definitions. There's cognitive empathy, where you understand another person's point of view. There's emotional empathy, where you feel another person's feelings. There's empathic behavior, where you enact ways of showing you understand someone else. So empathy as a term, as you're pointing out, is really focused on one person's connection to another. The word compassion, which I know we'll get to, has different overlaps. And so how the word compassion and empathy relate to each other is often contrasted with empathy being the way you either feel with another person or understand another person, compassion being feeling with another person, often focused on suffering. So with empathy, you get the power of empathic joy, for example. Now, those terms are really powerful and important. Mindsight, as you can see, was just a personal word I made up that I never even came out of the closet with, until years after I was kind of struggling with it inside of myself in medical school, and then found in pediatrics it was helpful, and then in psychiatry it was not talked about, but it was very helpful. And I guess the way the mindsight term embraces empathy and compassion and even mindfulness, we'll see, is in the following way. When you look at the mind as the center of our subjective experience. And it includes, of course, consciousness, although a lot of the information processing that we talk about the mind is, not in consciousness. So it's consciousness and non-conscious processing. Those two, subjective experience of consciousness, those are one aspect of mind. But another aspect of mind that Mindsight dives into is something that isn't really talked about much, which is a self-organizing process that is both embodied and it's relational. And this is where some of the studies of empathy don't really look at the kind of relational nature of mind. And it's where, in our work at the Mindsight Institute, we're really trying to take on this odd finding that for over 100,000 mental health professionals I've asked, less than 5% have ever been given a lecture on what the mind is. So over 95% of mental health professionals have never had something offered to them that said what the mental was, or for that matter, what the health was. And so what we try to do in Mindsight is say, okay, the mind is your subjective experience. The mind includes consciousness and non-conscious processing. But the mind is also a third function. It's a self-organizing emergent property that is regulating energy and information flow both within you and between you. And in that sense, seeing the mind sight, involves a process where you have an observing capacity to sense this energy and information flow in two places. It's both within your own bodily experience, so the sense in my heart, the sense in my intestines, what's arising up there, what's even happening in fear circuits in my brain, circuits that are threatened, or even parts of my brain where I'm having images and memories that are activating in these neural firing patterns. That's the inner part. But there's also a relational part of mind that Mindsight embraces, where you learn to sense energy and information flow between you and other people and even the larger planet. So in this sense, mind becomes something much more than just like insight into oneself, or that's the self-awareness part you mentioned, or empathy for another person. It embraces this larger skill that can be taught, where you stabilize attention to sense energy and information flow patterns inside and between you and others and the larger world.
So moving it maybe more into the sort of concrete or immediately useful for people, let's suppose then that we have someone who's really quite open to their own experience, quite tuned into it, quite aware of it. They're exercising Mindsight, if you will, internally, and also quite aware of other people. They're exercising Mindsight, empathy, mindful awareness of others externally. On the other hand, many people bring up an issue in which, as they open to others, they feel flooded, or they're afraid they'll feel flooded, particularly if they're not merely empathic, but on top of that empathy, they're having a quality of compassion, the wish that others not suffer, often associated with feelings of tender concern. So what are some of the ways that you've found as a therapist, a parent, a person, to help oneself be open to the interior, the other world of other people, and sustain qualities of compassion without feeling flooded by the pain and sorrows of the world?
Yeah, it's a beautiful question, Rick. Thank you. And I think it really draws on the beautiful work you've done in Buddha's Brain and in your teaching. And it's such an important question. I once did a conference with John O'Donohue, who is a Sounds True person who sadly has passed away almost 5 years ago now, and Diane Ackerman, a wonderful poet and essayist, and John Kabat-Zinn. And in that conference, by the end of the 3-day event, a woman took the microphone and asked just this question. She said, "We've been spending 3 days with you 4 people, and you've taught us to be more empathic and more compassionate. And I'm really mad at you because now I'm feeling all the suffering of the world, and this really hurts. Why would you do this to us?" And there's a couple ways of approaching this response. One, I'm going to tell you what we said to her, because it's directly related to your question. And the other is to respond directly with the mechanisms, which is what, we taught her and the whole group. Here's the idea for what we said to her. She was saying what I think is an important step on the journey to become compassionate, which is you open your heart up to sensing other people's experience, including their pain and their joys. But as you've written beautifully about, Rick, we tend to stick with the negative, and it holds on to us. And when you first experience that, it can just get extremely depressing, and you just feel overwhelmed. I was once teaching in a setting with the Dalai Lama, and someone said to him in the question and answer period, "How can you laugh so much and seem to be so happy when there's so much pain and suffering in the world? What's wrong with you?" That was the question addressed to him on a card. And I don't think anyone would say that they were speaking in a microphone. But his response was amazing. He said that it was not in spite of the suffering of the world that he could be happy and be laughing a lot, because he's a very joyful guy. But it was actually because of it that it's our responsibility to find the joy in life, the vitality of life, the humor in life, especially because there's so much suffering, because otherwise the suffering, in his words, would have won. And so what I said to her is I quoted her what the Dalai Lama said, and I said, look, if you look at some of the work in neuroscience from Jean Dessetti, for example, that's summarized in a book, beautiful book called The Neurobiology of Empathy, that he's a co-editor of, what you find is that if in the brain you take on the stance when you see a photograph of a painful accident, a horrible, horrible accident, and you say, what if that were me? Like you're saying, Rick. And you shut down. Any energy you have left to go and help that person, gone, you just want to withdraw. In contrast, instead of saying, what if that were me, you see the same photograph, and the stance you take is, I wonder what that person is feeling like in the accident that that person just got in. Then you can actually maintain balance. This relates to, in terms of the practical aspect from that study, what can we know? We can know that you actually have this balance, even in your brain, of an observing capacity that can observe that, for example, there's a feeling of sadness arising in me, a feeling of pain, that when I see this photograph of this terrible accident, a part of me wants to say, what if that were me? This observing circuit in you has the capacity, with skill training, this is what the Mindsight skills do, and it overlaps with what the neuroscience says, is you can actually allow yourself to say, this way of thinking, if that were me, is going to flood my system. And so there's a thing that I call name it to tame it, which is literally in the brain, when you name it, the sadness I feel, the overwhelming feeling I feel. What studies by David Cresswell at UCLA and others have shown is that when you name it, you literally tame the circuits of overwhelm, and you allow the brain to achieve equilibrium again. And from an observational and experiential point of view, what you're doing is you're letting an observing part of the brain, in a sense, name what you see. It's a classic mindfulness technique of naming a mental process, and then the whole system calms down. So the two things I would recommend in terms of practical steps for people who feel overwhelmed. Number one is when you develop this observational capacity with any mindfulness practice, in our institute, we use a fundamental integrative practice called the Wheel of Awareness, which has a central hub and an outer rim. And when people develop this, they develop the capacity to have awareness, the sense of knowing in the hub, and on the outer rim feelings, like feeling another person's pain or distress. And this distinction between the inner sense of knowing and on the rim that which is known gives people the strength, the resilience to actually be fully present for whatever is arising, and then to not become overwhelmed by it. If the rim, these things that we know, and the hub, the sense of knowing, become overlapped, then what happens is a person is flooded and they don't have the ability to stay present for what is. They either become overwhelmed and distracted or they withdraw. And in either case, they're not available to be there for the other person.